Hearing the word Collect-a-thon always floods my mind with a very specific set of games from my childhood. The genre stems from the early life of 3D gaming, and a lot of new games are spurned nowadays for not getting it right when they try to imitate these older titles. So what is it about this very specific genre that makes Collect-a-thon seemingly unapproachable by developers nowadays? Is it really just a dead or dying category, or is it really just that hard to get it right? I think it's a mixture of both. I wouldn't say the genre is dead in a traditional sense, but rather that it's evolved and hybridized with a lot of other categories. These larger genres have absorbed the Collect-a-thon aspect into them and made it less of the focus and more of the side objective. Does this still make these games Collect-a-thons? Not if you think about them along the same lines as, say, Banjo-Kazooie or Spyro the Dragon. So what makes a game a Collect-a-thon? Well, it depends on which definition you agree with. Let's take a look at these definitions and break it down real quick. There tends to be a divergence of opinion on whether simply having a monumental amount of things to grab make a game a Collect-a-thon, or if the central focus has to be collecting in order to progress. Regardless of definition, these are games which reward you for grabbing as many things as possible. However, many more games fit into the scope of Opinion A, which would encompass games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, Assassin's Creed, and Jet Set Radio. Opinion B, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more ironclad in its definition of a Collect-a-thon's composition, locking the genre down to games like Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and any other game that requires you to collect a variety of objects and items as the main focus to unlock new things and beat the game. This opinion also tends to have a bit of leeway depending on who you ask. Some people would include Super Mario Odyssey because you need to collect a certain amount of moons to beat the game, and others would exclude it and dismiss the game as more of an open-world platformer than a true Collect-a-thon. For the purposes of clarity, I'd say I personally fall closer to Opinion B in this scenario, as my mind always reaches back to those older games when I think of the word Collect-a-thon. And by this definition, there haven't been many good, pure Collect-a-thon games in a very long time. Everyone knows about Yooka-Laylee at this point, a game that was supposed to stand side by side with Banjo-Kazooie as a spiritual successor, and yet fell flat of that in many regards. The thing is, a lot of people agreed that the game is good for what it is, but it didn't feel like it had the same soul which those older games touted. Much of the criticism was aimed at how much it felt like a cheaper knockoff of Banjo rather than its descendant. When Yooka-Laylee dropped, and all of the judgments surrounding it began to bubble to the surface, I was of the opinion that the Collect-a-thon genre was nearly completely nostalgia-fueled at this point. But with games like A Hat in Time having an absolutely stellar showing, I really don't think the genre is dead, but that it definitely has become something different. The issue here is that a lot of people lament the loss of those older titles where collecting was the entire purpose of the game beyond beating the last boss. And I extend this idea to you. Those games were the best that 3D gaming could do at this point in time. They didn't need to have an amazing story or 200 side quests or alternate endings or New Game Plus. They were still pretty close to the cutting edge of gaming at the time of their release, and people were wowed just by some of the concepts that these games created. But if you take a game nowadays and you just make small, focused levels where you collect things, you need to have something different to make yourself stand out. A Hat in Time does this perfectly with its charming characters, variety of abilities, excellent soundtrack, and intense boss fights. But if you take one or two of these things away, A Hat in Time would likely be a forgettable game that tries to accomplish what its predecessors did and fell flat. Honestly, the Collect-a-thon is no longer a genre, it's a subgenre. And I think that this is for the best, because the chances of there being another game that perfectly captures the magic of these younger days is pretty slim in the now overflowing market of indie devs and new IPs. It really explains why A Hat in Time stands out so much. And that's just it, the pure Collect-a-thon as a type of game is extraordinarily difficult to keep the general audience's attention spans with. I know that when I was a kid, I'd nearly play anything for multiple hours without really thinking about if it was actually good or not. A prime example of this is Donkey Kong 64, a game I loved and honestly still love to a degree. Let's compare DK64 to one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, games in the genre, Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo's first adventure on the N64 is pretty widely regarded as some of the most fun you can have on the console, arriving a year and a half before DK. But what is it that makes it so compelling? At the end of the day, you're collecting musical notes, honeycomb, these annoying bastards, ecum pokums, upgrades, and osteoporosis. On the surface, this just sounds like a bunch of crap to collect, and it is. But then you have the controls. Being able to walk faster with Kazooie, flying around, floating and gliding and transforming into different creatures, all of which feels really good. The music shifts and changes depending on the area, and it's wonderful. The stage designs are set up in a way where you're never really lost and you usually know which part of the map you're in due to the different landmarks. It's difficult, but most of the time your deaths are your fault. It's honestly just some really good design all around, and the game wouldn't have the same amount of charm and entertainment value if it had clunkier controls, or too many things to collect, or if the maps are too big or look the same, or even a worse soundtrack. Then you have something like Donkey Kong 64, a game which holds a very dear place in my heart, but one that's flawed in its own right. DK64 takes all of that stuff you have to collect and restricts different bits to different characters. Nearly every important collectible is restricted to a specific Kong. Tokens, blueprints, regular and golden bananas are all something that you have to run around and find a change barrel to pick out the correct Kong to grab. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoy the game, but the tedium of playing every level 5 times through with each Kong is a bit excessive. This has only been compounded due to the fact that all of these items have seemingly been dumped almost randomly throughout these stages. There aren't as many of those trails which lead you to something bigger like there is in Banjo. The soundtrack is still amazing because Grant Kirkhope, but the game is overall flawed in other areas where Banjo isn't. The fact that these games are 1.5 years apart and yet the former is generally regarded as better than the latter is a telling detail and a prime example of just how hard it is to get this genre right. Have you or a loved one been a victim of this beetle race? Hi, I'm Salt Manfist, here representing the Salt Factory Racing Beetle Special Victims Unit. Millions of Americans are victims of Angry Aztec's beetle race, and it's far more common than one might think. This condition is a direct result of years of repressed beetle racing memories, with many lamenting the fact that they've never beaten this beetle. If this has happened to you or a loved one, please reach out to us at the number on the screen. No one has to suffer through this alone. They just have to suffer with everyone else knowing that I beat it and they didn't. Which is why I think that the shift towards creating games that do their own thing while collecting extra things on the side is honestly the way to go. Game design and capability has advanced so much that oftentimes it's harder to create small to medium-sized levels that feel really good to navigate instead of making huge, sprawling, cumbersome areas to dump a bunch of shit to collect into. The Collect-a-thon aspect of a story-driven, open-world game tends to be a side incentive to hold a player's interest while they cross a desert or push through a grassland, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. When the focus isn't to grab everything that you see, a player will oftentimes find themselves wanting to collect those random objects as long as they're having fun. But if you're going to constrain your game to collecting as many things as possible, you need to limit its scale and make it intuitive, not just sprinkle random objects everywhere. The main and final point that I've been working towards here is that to me, Collect-a-thons are a relic of a time where games could only do so much. And while it certainly isn't impossible to create another entry into the genre which is satisfying to play and generally regarded as a great game, it oftentimes isn't worth the trouble of reassembling your game to fit those constraints if your vision is something more. You don't need to take a perfectly good platformer that's challenging and interesting and just dump collectibles right and left into it for no other reason other than, hey, it'll give those completionists something to do. And while there's nothing wrong with pushing in a few shinies every here and there for the players to seek out and pocket, it gets redundant fast if you don't implement it in a way that's fun to work towards. I know that I'm a hell of a lot more likely to start seeking out every little part of the map if I'm having a kick-ass time playing the game in the first place. Again, I'm not saying that this niche category is dead and gone. The hype for Yooka-Laylee is proof enough that the fans of the genre are still around and waiting. But that vision of a game flooded with collectibles needs to come naturally as something that you build around. Am I going out of my way to grab a coin and then coming way back to continue on? Or am I being led there naturally through interesting level design choices and well-placed pathways of other fun things to collect? And if you just want to fill in the gaps of your open world game with shinies for the player to collect, make it fun and intentional, not random and aggravating. So here's to hoping that we see a few more great Collect-a-thons in the future. I know it's a pretty constraining category at times, but when it's done right, it feels really good to scratch that collecting itch. Thanks for watching. This is definitely one of the shorter videos I've done recently, but I just wanted to get something out after my 3 weeks of vacation. I'm sure I'll be back with another long-winded sermon next, so thanks for sticking around until then. As always, I have a Twitch, I have a Twitter, I have a Discord, and I don't know how to use any of them. Have a good one.